The summer of 1994 was supposed to be a fresh start for Sarah Chen and her 15-year-old daughter, Michelle. After months of planning their move from Seattle to San Francisco, they packed their burgundy Honda Accord with everything they owned and set off down the coastal highway on what should have been a simple 2-day drive. But somewhere between leaving their old life behind and reaching their new beginning, they simply vanished. For 17 years, their disappearance remained one of the most baffling missing persons cases on the West Coast. No witnesses, no clues, no trace of their car, or any sign they'd ever made it past the Oregon border. Then in 2011, a routine harbor dredging operation in a small coastal town pulled something unexpected from the murky depths of the Pacific Ocean. What they found would finally answer the question that had haunted two families and an entire community for nearly 2 decades. But the truth they uncovered was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. I'm about to take you through a case that challenges everything you think you know about missing persons investigations. We're going to explore how a mother and daughter could disappear without a trace on a well-traveled highway, why it took 17 years to find them, and the shocking revelation that emerged when their car was finally recovered. By the end of this story, you'll understand how easily someone can vanish in plain sight and why this particular case changed how authorities approach coastal disappearances forever. Sarah Chen had been planning this move for over a year. At 38, she was a graphic designer who'd spent the last decade building a freelance business from her cramped Seattle apartment. The divorce from Michelle's father had been finalized 6 months earlier, and Sarah saw the job offer from a San Francisco design firm as the perfect opportunity for a clean slate. Michelle, despite being reluctant to leave her friends behind, had warmed up to the idea of living near the ocean and attending a new school where nobody knew about her parents' messy separation. They left Seattle on Saturday morning, July 16th, with their Honda packed to the ceiling. Sarah had sold most of their furniture, keeping only what would fit in the car and a small moving truck that had departed 2 days earlier. The plan was straightforward: drive down Interstate 5 to Portland, then take Highway 101 along the coast to San Francisco. Sarah had booked them a room at a seaside motel in Crescent City for Saturday night, giving them time to enjoy the scenic route on Sunday before arriving at their new apartment Monday morning. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah and Michelle came from a gas station attendant in Olympia, Washington, just 90 minutes south of Seattle. Security footage showed Sarah filling up the Honda while Michelle bought snacks from the convenience store. The timestamp read 11:47 a.m. Sarah appeared calm, even cheerful, as she chatted with the attendant about their road trip plans. Michelle looked like any typical teenager, slightly bored but not distressed. After that, nothing. When they failed to check into their motel reservation in Crescent City, the desk clerk simply marked it as a no-show. Sarah's new employer in San Francisco didn't become concerned until Tuesday morning when she missed her scheduled apartment viewing. It wasn't until Wednesday that Michelle's father, David, received a frantic call from the landlord asking where his ex-wife was. The moving truck had arrived on schedule, but nobody was there to receive it. David immediately drove to Seattle and found their apartment empty, exactly as Sarah had left it. The mail had been stopped, utilities canceled, everything arranged for their departure. He called the Oregon State Police, who initially treated it as a routine missing persons case. Two women driving down a major highway. They'd probably just changed their plans or had car trouble somewhere with poor cell coverage. But as hours turned to days and days turned to weeks, the case grew more mysterious. The Honda hadn't been spotted by any traffic cameras, no credit card activity, no cell phone pings, no reports of accidents or breakdowns. It was as if Sarah and Michelle had driven into thin air somewhere between Olympia and their destination 400 miles south. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. State police from Washington, Oregon, and California coordinated search efforts along the entire route. They checked every hospital, every impound lot, every body of water visible from the highway. Volunteer search teams combed the forests along Interstate 5 and Highway 101, looking for any sign of the burgundy Honda or its occupants. Detective Ray Morrison of the Oregon State Police became obsessed with the case. He'd been investigating missing persons for 12 years and had never encountered anything quite like this. Two people don't just disappear on a major highway without leaving some trace behind. There had to be something everyone was missing. Morrison's theory was that Sarah had deliberately changed their route, possibly to avoid her ex-husband or to make an unplanned stop somewhere. He spent months tracking down every friend, relative, and business contact Sarah had ever mentioned. He investigated rumors that she'd been having financial troubles, that she'd been dating someone secretly, that she'd planned to disappear and start over with new identities. Every lead turned into a dead end. Michelle's friends were interviewed repeatedly. Her teachers, her father's family, even her pediatrician, anyone who might have insight into the family's plans or state of mind. The picture that emerged was of a loving mother and daughter who were genuinely excited about their new life in San Francisco. There were no signs of depression, no indication Sarah was planning anything other than exactly what she'd told everyone. The case attracted significant media attention. Sarah and Michelle's photos appeared on missing persons websites, milk cartons, and billboards throughout the Pacific Northwest. America's Most Wanted featured their story twice. Psychics called with visions, conspiracy theorists suggested government cover-ups, and well-meaning citizens reported sightings from Alaska to Mexico. None of it led anywhere. As the months stretched into years, the active investigation gradually wound down. Morrison retired in 2003, still haunted by the case he could never solve. The file remained open, but with no new leads and limited resources, it joined the growing stack of cold cases that departments across the country struggle to manage. Sarah's elderly parents never stopped hoping. They hired private investigators, maintained a website with updated photos showing how Michelle might look as she aged, and organized annual vigils on the anniversary of the disappearance. David remarried and moved to Colorado, but he still called the police department every few months, asking if there had been any developments. The local community in Seattle held on to the story longer than most. Sarah had been well known in the design community, and Michelle's high school retired her jersey number from the track team. But even there, as classmates graduated and moved away, as neighbors sold their homes and new families moved in, the memory of the missing mother and daughter began to fade. By 2010, 16 years after their disappearance, The case existed mainly in digital archives and the hearts of family members who refused to give up hope. The Burgundy Honda Accord had been entered into national databases, its license plate number flagged in systems across North America. But after so many years with no hits, even the most optimistic investigators had begun to assume they would never be found. Then came the morning of September 14th, 2011. The Port of Bandon, Oregon, was conducting its annual harbor maintenance, a routine dredging operation to clear accumulated silt and debris from the shipping channels. It was tedious work that usually yielded nothing more interesting than old tires, shopping carts, and the occasional piece of maritime equipment lost during storms. Captain Jake Williams had been running dredging operations for 15 years and thought he'd seen everything the ocean could give back. His crew worked methodically, the massive hydraulic arm scooping mud and debris from the harbor floor and depositing it onto examination barges where workers sorted through the mess before disposal. Around 10:30 that morning, Williams noticed something unusual in the latest haul. Mixed in with the typical debris was what appeared to be part of a car bumper, still bearing traces of burgundy paint. It wasn't uncommon to find pieces of vehicles that had washed into the harbor during winter storms, but this fragment looked different, less weathered than the typical ocean debris. Williams called for a more careful examination of the area where the bumper had been found. The next scoop brought up a license plate, bent and covered in marine growth, but still partially readable. Williams felt his stomach drop as he made out the letters and numbers. They matched a BOLO alert that had been circulating for years. Within an hour, the harbor was swarming with police boats, divers, and recovery equipment. The dredging operation was halted as specialized teams took over, carefully excavating the area where the bumper and license plate had been discovered. What they found, buried under 17 years of silt and marine debris, would finally answer the questions that had haunted investigators and family members for nearly 2 decades. But it would also raise new questions that were far more disturbing than the original mystery. The recovery operation took 3 days. Working in shifts around the clock, divers and underwater recovery specialists slowly uncovered the remains of Sarah and Michelle's Honda Accord. The car was remarkably intact, preserved by the cold ocean water and protected by the layers of silt that had accumulated over the years. As the vehicle was carefully lifted from the harbor floor, investigators could see that the windows were still closed. The doors remained shut. Everything about the car's position and condition suggested it had gone into the water intact, not as the result of an accident or natural disaster. The initial examination revealed something that made Detective Morrison, called out of retirement to consult on the case, question everything he thought he knew about the disappearance. The car's GPS system, a cutting-edge feature for 1994, was still functional. When technicians finally accessed its memory, they discovered the last programmed destination. It wasn't San Francisco. It wasn't anywhere Sarah had ever mentioned to family or friends. The coordinates led to a remote section of coastline 30 miles north of Bandon, accessible only by a narrow logging road that most travelers would never know existed. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. Inside the Honda, investigators found Sarah and Michelle's belongings exactly as they would have been during a normal road trip. Suitcases in the back seat, purses containing identification and cash, even Michelle's portable CD player with headphones still attached. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything violent had occurred inside the vehicle. What there was, however, changed everything investigators thought they knew about the case. Hidden beneath the driver's seat, wrapped in plastic and somehow preserved despite 17 years underwater, investigators found a handwritten note. The paper was water damaged but still legible, written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. The message was brief, just 4 words that would completely reshape the investigation. "He knows we're here." Detective Morrison stared at the note for a full minute before calling in the FBI. This wasn't a case of 2 women getting lost or having an accident. Someone had been following them. Someone had forced them off their planned route to this remote location where their car could disappear into the ocean without a trace. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies up and down the coast. If Sarah and Michelle had been targeted, if their disappearance was the result of foul play, then investigators had spent 17 years looking in all the wrong places for all the wrong reasons. The forensic examination of the Honda revealed additional disturbing details. The car's odometer showed they had driven nearly 200 miles beyond their last confirmed location in Olympia. But according to the GPS data, they hadn't taken the direct route to their final destination. Instead, the system showed a complex pattern of stops and route changes, as if they had been trying to evade someone or had been forced to make multiple detours. Even more chilling was the discovery of Sarah's cell phone, found wedged between the passenger seat cushions. The phone had been turned off manually, not due to a dead battery. The last call in its memory was to 911, placed at 3:17 p.m. on the day they disappeared. The call had lasted only 8 seconds before being disconnected. Investigators immediately contacted the 911 dispatch centers along their suspected route, searching for any record of Sarah's emergency call. What they found was a single notation in a dispatcher's log from Coos County, Oregon. A partial call had been received that afternoon, a woman's voice saying, "Please help us, he's," before the line went dead. The dispatcher had attempted to call back, but received no answer. With no location data and no way to trace the call, it had been logged as a possible prank or accidental dial. The FBI's involvement brought new resources and expertise to the case. Agent Sarah Kim, a specialist in abduction cases, took the lead on re-examining 17 years of evidence through the lens of this new information. She started with the assumption that Sarah and Michelle had been followed from Seattle, possibly by someone who knew about their travel plans. Kim's team began by creating a detailed timeline of Sarah's activities in the weeks leading up to their departure. They interviewed her neighbors, clients, even the movers who had handled their belongings. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been increasingly anxious in the days before leaving Seattle, though she had attributed her nervousness to the stress of moving. Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, remembered seeing an unfamiliar car parked across the street several times during that final week. A dark sedan with tinted windows that didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. She had mentioned it to Sarah, who had dismissed it as probably belonging to a visitor or real estate agent showing houses in the area. The moving company provided another crucial piece of information. The driver who had picked up Sarah's belongings on Thursday remembered a man asking questions about the destination. The stranger had claimed to be a friend helping with the move, but something about his manner had made the driver uncomfortable. He had refused to provide any information, but the incident had stuck in his memory. Agent Kim realized they were dealing with someone who had been planning this for days, possibly weeks, someone who knew Sarah's routine, her travel plans, even the route she intended to take. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. It was a carefully orchestrated abduction that had been designed to look like a simple disappearance. The investigation expanded to include Sarah's professional contacts and ex-husband David. While David had been cleared early in the original investigation, Kim wanted to re-examine his alibi and financial records. She also looked into Sarah's client list, searching for anyone who might have developed an unhealthy obsession with her. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Michelle's best friend, Jessica, now 32 and living in Portland, contacted the FBI after seeing news coverage of the car's discovery. She had been 15 when Michelle disappeared, and there was something she had never told investigators because she hadn't thought it was important at the time. 2 weeks before the move, Michelle had mentioned that her mother seemed worried about someone from work. Sarah had apparently told Michelle that one of her clients had been calling too frequently and asking personal questions about their family. Michelle hadn't gotten the man's name, but she remembered her mother changing their phone number and being more careful about locking doors. Agent Kim immediately began examining Sarah's client records from 1994. Most of the files had been stored by Sarah's former business partner, who had maintained them for tax purposes. Among the dozens of projects Sarah had worked on that year, one client stood out. Marcus Webb had hired Sarah to design promotional materials for his small import business. The initial project had been completed in March 1994, but Webb had continued to call with additional requests and changes well into June. Sarah's notes in the client file showed increasing frustration with his demands and what she described as inappropriate personal questions. The final entry in Webb's file was dated July 10th, just 6 days before Sarah and Michelle disappeared. Sarah had written, "Terminated client relationship due to harassment. Returned unused retainer. Do not work with this individual again." Kim's team immediately began searching for Marcus Webb. What they discovered was a man with a history of stalking and obsessive behavior toward women. Webb had been arrested twice in the 1980s for harassment, though the charges had been dropped when his victims moved away or declined to testify. But Marcus Webb had died in 2003, apparently taking whatever knowledge he had about Sarah and Michelle's fate to his grave. The investigation seemed to have reached another dead end until Kim decided to examine Webb's property records and financial history. Webb had owned a small cabin on the Oregon coast, just 15 miles from where the Honda had been discovered. The property had been sold after his death, but county records showed he had purchased it in April 1994, just 1 month after beginning work with Sarah. The current owners of the property, a retired couple from California, were cooperative when FBI agents arrived to search the grounds. They had bought the cabin as a vacation home and had done extensive renovations, but they remembered finding some unusual items in the basement when they first moved in. In their storage shed, carefully preserved in boxes, were items they had found but hadn't known what to do with. Among them were photographs of Sarah and Michelle, apparently taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. There were images of them at their Seattle apartment, at Michelle's school, even at the grocery store. The photos were dated throughout the spring of 1994, documenting months of surveillance. But the most chilling discovery was a detailed map of the Oregon coast with several locations marked in red ink. One of the marks corresponded exactly to where the Honda had been found. Another showed the location of Webb's cabin. The remaining marks indicated other remote coastal areas where Kim realized with growing horror other people might have disappeared. The FBI immediately began cross-referencing missing persons cases along the Oregon and California coasts, looking for other disappearances that might be connected to Marcus Webb. What they found was a pattern that had been invisible for decades because the cases had been handled by different jurisdictions and separated by years. Between 1989 and 2003, 7 other people had vanished while traveling along coastal highways in the Pacific Northwest. All were women traveling alone or with children. All had disappeared without a trace, their vehicles never found, and all had some connection, however tenuous, to Marcus Webb's known activities and locations. The Sarah and Michelle Chen case was no longer an isolated mystery. It was part of a serial crime spree that had gone undetected for over a decade, hidden by the vastness of the Pacific Ocean and the assumption that missing travelers had simply had accidents or chosen to disappear. As investigators worked to piece together the full scope of Webb's crimes, they faced a grim reality. The ocean had preserved Sarah and Michelle's car, but it had likely claimed other evidence that would never be recovered. The truth about what happened to the other missing women might remain forever hidden beneath the waves. But for Sarah's parents and Michelle's father, the discovery of the Honda finally provided the answers they had been seeking for 17 years. Their loved ones hadn't chosen to abandon their old lives or start over somewhere new. They had been victims of a predator who had carefully planned their abduction and murder. The case that had baffled investigators for nearly 2 decades was finally solved, but it had opened the door to an even larger investigation that would continue for years to come. The revelation that Marcus Webb was potentially responsible for multiple disappearances sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Agent Kim assembled a task force comprised of detectives from every jurisdiction where similar cases had occurred. For the first time, investigators began connecting dots that had been scattered across decades and hundreds of miles of coastline. The pattern that emerged was both methodical and terrifying. Webb had operated like a predator, studying his prey, selecting victims who fit a specific profile. All were women between the ages of 25 and 40, traveling with children or alone, and all had some form of professional interaction with Webb's various business ventures over the years. Detective Morrison, despite being officially retired, found himself drawn back into the investigation that had consumed 9 years of his career. He worked closely with Agent Kim to re-examine every missing persons case along the coastal corridor, applying this new lens of understanding to disappearances that had previously seemed random and unconnected. The first connection they established was Linda Morrison, no relation to the detective who had vanished in 1991 while driving from Portland to Los Angeles with her 8-year-old son. Linda had been a freelance photographer who had done work for Webb's import business just months before her disappearance. Her Ford Explorer was never found, and investigators had assumed she had driven off a mountain road during a winter storm. Then there was Rebecca Santos, a marketing consultant who disappeared in 1995 while traveling from San Francisco to Seattle with her twin daughters. Rebecca had designed advertising materials for one of Webb's shell companies in early 1995. Her silver Volvo wagon had vanished somewhere along Highway 101, and despite extensive searches, no trace of the family was ever discovered. The most chilling case was that of Jennifer Park, a young attorney who had represented Webb in a contract dispute in 1997. Jennifer had been driving alone from Eugene to San Diego when she disappeared near the California border. Her BMW was found a week later in a shopping mall parking lot in Medford, Oregon, wiped clean of fingerprints and abandoned. Jennifer herself was never seen again. Each case shared disturbing similarities beyond just the victim profile. All the women had reported feeling watched or followed in the weeks before their disappearances. Several had changed their phone numbers or modified their travel plans due to what they described as unwanted attention from male clients or associates. Most significantly, all the disappearances had occurred near coastal areas where Webb owned property or had documented business interests. The FBI's analysis of his financial records revealed a network of small properties, storage units, and business fronts scattered along the Pacific coast from Washington to Northern California. Agent Kim's team began the painstaking process of searching these locations. Many had been sold or demolished in the years since Webb's death, but several remained accessible. At a storage unit in Eureka, California, investigators found boxes of surveillance photographs documenting Webb's other victims. The images showed women and children going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched and cataloged by a predator. The photographs were organized with disturbing precision. Each woman had her own file containing images taken over several months, along with handwritten notes detailing their routines, travel patterns, and family situations. Webb had studied his victims like a scientist conducting research, learning everything about their lives before making his move. Sarah Chen's file was among the most extensive. Webb had been photographing her and Michelle since February 1994, 5 months before their disappearance. The images showed them at home, at school, even during casual weekend trips around Seattle. Webb had documented their entire lives, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The notes in Sarah's file revealed the calculating nature of Webb's planning. He had recorded the dates when Michelle's father picked her up for visits, mapped out Sarah's regular jogging routes, and even noted which neighbors were frequently away from home. When Sarah announced her plans to move to San Francisco, Webb had seen his opportunity and acted quickly to intercept them. Dr. Amanda Foster, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case, explained that Webb represented a particularly dangerous type of serial killer. Unlike impulse killers, who acted on sudden urges, Webb was what experts called an organized predator. He selected his victims carefully, planned his attacks meticulously, and took elaborate steps to avoid detection. The ocean disposal method was particularly sophisticated. By forcing his victims' vehicles into remote coastal waters, Webb had ensured that evidence would be scattered or destroyed by saltwater corrosion. The Pacific Ocean's depth and currents meant that most vehicles would never be found, leaving families without answers and investigators without crime scenes to examine. Webb's psychological profile suggested he was motivated by a need for complete control over his victims. The surveillance phase allowed him to feel powerful and dominant before he ever made contact. The abduction itself was likely just the culmination of months of psychological manipulation and stalking. Agent Kim theorized that Webb didn't simply kill his victims immediately. The remote coastal properties he owned suggested he may have held them captive for periods of time before ultimately disposing of their bodies at sea. The isolation of these locations would have allowed him to indulge his need for control without fear of discovery. The investigation into Webb's background revealed a man who had been building toward these crimes for decades. Born in 1952, he had grown up in a series of foster homes after his mother abandoned him at age 6. His foster care records documented patterns of behavioral problems, including animal cruelty, fire setting, and aggressive behavior toward female classmates. As an adult, Webb had drifted through a series of jobs and relationships, never maintaining stable employment or personal connections for more than a few years. He had started several small businesses, usually import-export ventures, that gave him reasons to travel and interact with professional women who worked in marketing, design, and consulting. Former associates described Webb as charming but unsettling. He had a talent for making people feel uncomfortable without doing anything overtly threatening. Several women who had worked with him professionally reported feeling watched or followed after their business relationships ended, but none had filed formal complaints with police. The import business that had brought Webb into contact with Sarah Chen was typical of his operations. He would establish a legitimate-seeming company, hire freelance professionals for various projects, then use these business relationships to gain access to potential victims' personal information and routines. Webb's financial records showed he had been quite successful at his legitimate business ventures, earning enough money to maintain multiple properties and fund his elaborate surveillance operations. He had been careful to keep his criminal activities separate from his business dealings, never leaving obvious trails that would connect him to his victims. The break in the case had come only because Sarah and Michelle's car had been discovered in relatively shallow water near a busy harbor. If Webb had disposed of their vehicle in deeper ocean waters, as he apparently had with his other victims, they might never have been found. Agent Kim's team expanded their search to include oceanographic surveys of areas near Webb's other properties. Using sophisticated sonar equipment, they began scanning the ocean floor for additional vehicles that might contain evidence of Webb's crimes. The search was expensive and time-consuming, but the FBI committed significant resources to finding answers for the other families. The first major discovery came in December 2011, just 3 months after Sarah and Michelle's car had been recovered. Sonar operators detected what appeared to be a vehicle submerged in 90 feet of water off the coast near Brookings, Oregon. The location corresponded to an area near one of Webb's former properties. The recovery operation was far more complex than the Bandon Harbor dredging. Working in deep ocean waters required specialized equipment and expert divers trained in underwater crime scene investigation. The operation took 2 weeks and cost over $200,000, but what they found justified every expense. The vehicle was Linda Morrison's Ford Explorer, the same car she had been driving when she disappeared with her son in 1991. Like Sarah and Michelle's Honda, the Explorer was remarkably well preserved by the cold ocean water. Inside, investigators found personal belongings that confirmed the identities of the victims and provided additional evidence of Webb's methods. More importantly, they found something that had been missing from the other crime scenes. Hidden in the Explorer's spare tire compartment, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, was a detailed journal documenting Webb's activities. The journal contained entries spanning from 1989 to 1991, providing investigators with unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. The journal entries were written in Webb's precise handwriting and documented his surveillance activities, victim selection process, and detailed plans for each abduction. Reading through the pages, investigators could trace the evolution of Webb's methods as he became more sophisticated and confident in his ability to avoid detection. Early entries showed Webb struggling with impulse control and making mistakes that could have led to his capture. But over time, he developed increasingly elaborate protocols for selecting victims, conducting surveillance, and disposing of evidence. By the time he targeted Sarah and Michelle in 1994, he had refined his methods to near perfection. The journal also contained disturbing details about what happened to his victims after their abductions. Webb had held most of them captive for several days or weeks at his remote properties before ultimately killing them and disposing of their bodies at sea. The isolation of his coastal locations had allowed him to indulge his sadistic fantasies without fear of interruption. Perhaps most chilling were Webb's reflections on his own motivations. He wrote extensively about his need to possess and control his victims completely. The surveillance phase wasn't just preparation for the abduction, it was an integral part of his psychological gratification. He derived pleasure from watching his victims go about their daily lives, unaware that their fate had already been decided. The discovery of Webb's journal provided closure for multiple families, while simultaneously opening new avenues of investigation. The entries referenced several victims who had not yet been identified, suggesting that Webb's crime spree had been even more extensive than previously believed. When Agent Kim assembled a team of analysts to cross-reference the journal entries with missing persons databases across the western United States, they were looking for cases that matched Webb's victim profile and occurred during time periods when he was known to be operating in specific geographic areas. The analysis revealed at least 4 additional probable victims, women who had disappeared under circumstances consistent with Webb's methods but had never been connected to his activities. These cases spanned from 1989 to 2002, suggesting that Webb had been active as a serial killer for over a decade before his death. The investigation had grown from a single missing persons case into one of the largest serial killer investigations in Pacific Northwest history. The FBI established a dedicated task force with agents assigned full-time to tracking down evidence of Webb's crimes and providing answers to families who had been waiting decades for closure. The psychological impact on the families was immeasurable. David Chen, Michelle's father, struggled to process the revelation that his daughter and ex-wife had spent their final hours in terror. For 17 years, he had clung to the hope that they might have chosen to disappear, that somewhere they were living new lives under different names. The truth was far more devastating. Sarah's parents, now in their 80s, found themselves grappling with conflicting emotions. Relief at finally knowing what happened warred with horror at the details of their daughter's final days. The surveillance photographs were particularly disturbing, showing that Webb had been watching their granddaughter for months before the abduction. The community response was equally complex. Residents of the small coastal towns where Webb had operated felt violated by the knowledge that a predator had been living among them for years. Many recalled interactions with Webb, remembering him as odd but harmless. The realization that they had been sharing their communities with a serial killer left lasting scars. Support groups formed spontaneously as families of Webb's victims connected with each other for the first time. They shared stories, compared experiences, and found comfort in finally understanding that their loved ones' disappearances hadn't been random tragedies, but the calculated actions of a methodical killer. The legal ramifications were complicated by Webb's death 8 years earlier. There could be no trial, no formal justice for his crimes. Instead, the FBI and local prosecutors focused on providing comprehensive answers to families and ensuring that all of Webb's victims were properly identified and honored. A memorial service was held in Portland in March 2012, bringing together families from across the Pacific Northwest. Representatives from law enforcement agencies that had worked the various cases over the years attended, many of them emotional as they finally saw closure to investigations that had haunted their careers. Detective Morrison spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he addressed the families. He apologized for the years of uncertainty, for the false hopes and dead ends that had prolonged their suffering, but he also praised their persistence, noting that it was family pressure and media attention that had kept the cases alive long enough for the truth to emerge. The investigation continued well into 2013 as underwater search teams methodically examined areas near Webb's other properties. 2 more vehicles were recovered, confirming the fates of Rebecca Santos and her twin daughters, and Jennifer Park. Each recovery brought both closure and renewed grief to families who had been waiting decades for answers. The final tally was staggering. Webb was ultimately linked to the murders of 11 people spanning 14 years. His victims included 8 women and 3 children, all killed in a methodical campaign of surveillance, abduction, and murder that had gone undetected because of the vastness of the Pacific Ocean and the jurisdictional boundaries that prevented law enforcement agencies from seeing the larger pattern. Dr. Foster's final psychological profile painted Webb as one of the most organized and patient serial killers in modern criminal history. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting elaborate surveillance operations demonstrated a level of self-control that made him particularly dangerous. Unlike killers who eventually escalated to the point of making mistakes, Webb had maintained his discipline until his natural death, never giving investigators the break they needed to identify him. The case led to significant changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted along the Pacific coast. A new multi-jurisdictional database was established to track disappearances across state lines, ensuring that patterns like Webb's could be identified more quickly in the future. Advanced sonar technology was deployed to systematically search coastal waters for submerged vehicles. The program, funded by federal grants and private donations, has since recovered dozens of vehicles and provided closure to families across the region. Perhaps most importantly, the case highlighted the vulnerability of professional women who work with clients in isolated settings. Law enforcement agencies developed new protocols for recognizing and investigating stalking behavior, particularly when it involves business relationships that give predators access to personal information. The Sarah and Michelle Chen case had started as a simple missing persons investigation. Two women who had vanished during what should have been a routine road trip. But the discovery of their car 17 years later had revealed something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that had claimed multiple lives across multiple states. For the families involved, the resolution brought a mixture of peace and pain. They finally knew what had happened to their loved ones, but the knowledge came with the devastating realization of how much their family members had suffered. The surveillance photographs and journal entries provided answers, but they also revealed the calculated cruelty of a predator who had stolen not just lives, but years of hope and uncertainty from those left behind. The ocean that had hidden Webb's crimes for so long ultimately became the source of evidence that exposed them. The same cold waters that had preserved Sarah and Michelle's car had also preserved the truth about a serial killer whose crimes might otherwise have remained forever hidden beneath the waves. As the investigation finally concluded in late 2013, Agent Kim reflected on the case that had consumed 3 years of her career. The technical aspects had been challenging, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and the deployment of expensive underwater recovery equipment. But the human cost had been far greater, measured not just in the lives lost, but in the decades of suffering endured by families who had never stopped searching for answers. The case serves as a stark reminder of how easily people can disappear in modern society and how predators can exploit the assumptions and limitations of law enforcement to avoid detection. But it also demonstrates the power of persistence, both from families who refuse to give up hope and from investigators who continue pursuing justice even when cases seem hopeless. Today, a memorial plaque in Bandon Harbor marks the spot where Sarah and Michelle's car was recovered. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of those lost to the sea, and in gratitude to those who brought them home." It serves as a quiet reminder of a case that changed how we think about missing persons investigations and the lengths to which some predators will go to avoid detection. The memorial plaque stands as more than just a marker of tragedy. It represents the moment when 17 years of questions finally found their answers, when families learned the truth they had both craved and dreaded. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a warning about how easily predators can hide in plain sight, using legitimate business relationships and geographic distance to mask their true intentions. The Chen case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches coastal disappearances. Before Webb's crimes were uncovered, missing persons along highway corridors were often treated as isolated incidents. Investigators focused on immediate family relationships, financial troubles, or simple accidents. The possibility that a methodical predator might be selecting victims across multiple jurisdictions rarely entered their calculations. Agent Kim established new protocols that are now standard practice throughout the Pacific Northwest. When someone disappears along coastal routes, Investigators immediately cross-referenced the case with similar disappearances in neighboring states. They examined the victims' professional relationships more carefully, looking for business contacts who might have had access to personal information or travel plans. The database that emerged from the Webb investigation has since identified 3 other potential serial killers operating along different highway corridors. In each case, the pattern only became visible when disappearances were examined collectively rather than as isolated incidents. The technology that recovered Sarah and Michelle's car has been deployed in dozens of other cases, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Detective Morrison, now fully retired, often speaks at law enforcement conferences about the importance of persistence in cold cases. He emphasizes that the Chen case was solved not through brilliant detective work, but through methodical investigation and the willingness to reconsider old assumptions when new evidence emerged. For David Chen, the resolution brought a complex mix of emotions that took years to process. He had remarried and started a new family, but the discovery of what happened to Sarah and Michelle reopened wounds he thought had healed. Therapy helped him understand that his grief was not just for their deaths, but for the 17 years of uncertainty that had shaped his entire adult life. Sarah's parents chose to establish a foundation in their daughter and granddaughter's memory. The organization provides grants for advanced sonar equipment and underwater recovery operations, ensuring that other families won't have to wait 17 years for answers. They've funded searches that have recovered over 40 vehicles from coastal waters, bringing closure to dozens of families. The foundation also supports research into criminal psychology, specifically focusing on how organized predators select and stalk their victims. Carter Foster continues her work on understanding killers like Webb, hoping to develop better methods for identifying them before they can claim additional victims. Jenny, Michelle's childhood friend, became an advocate for missing persons cases. She works with families to maintain media attention on cold cases and coordinates volunteer search efforts throughout the Pacific Northwest. She keeps Michelle's memory alive by telling her story at schools and community events, emphasizing how important it is to trust instincts about people who make you uncomfortable. The small coastal communities where Webb operated have had to grapple with the knowledge that they harbored a killer for over a decade. Bandon, where the car was recovered, embraced its role in solving the case. The harbor where the discovery was made has become an unlikely pilgrimage site for families of missing persons who come to pay their respects and find hope that their own mysteries might someday be solved. The psychological impact on investigators was significant. Many of the officers who worked the original cases struggled with guilt over missed connections and overlooked evidence. Counseling programs were established to help law enforcement personnel process the emotional toll of cold cases that suddenly break open with devastating revelations. Captain Williams, who made the initial discovery during the harbor dredging operation, kept detailed records of everything his crew pulled from the water. His documentation proved crucial during the investigation and led to his appointment as coordinator for coastal recovery operations. He now oversees a network of harbor masters and dredging operators who are trained to recognize potential evidence. The technical aspects of the recovery operation led to advances in underwater crime scene investigation. The methods developed to preserve evidence from vehicles that had been submerged for decades are now taught at forensic training centers across the country. The success rate for recovering usable evidence from long submerged vehicles has improved dramatically as a result. Webb's journal, beyond providing evidence of his crimes, offered unprecedented insight into the mind of an organized serial killer. Criminologists continue to study his writings, looking for patterns that might help identify similar predators before they can accumulate multiple victims. His methodical approach to victim selection has become a case study in criminal psychology programs. The import business model that Webb used to approach potential victims has led to increased scrutiny of similar operations. Professional associations now provide guidelines for freelancers and consultants on how to safely vet new clients and recognize potentially dangerous situations. Sarah's story is often used as an example of why basic safety protocols are essential. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of people during major life transitions, moving to a new city, starting a new job, or going through a divorce, all create situations where normal support networks are disrupted. Predators like Webb specifically targeted people during these vulnerable periods when they were more likely to be isolated and less likely to have consistent contact with friends and family. Michelle's age at the time of her disappearance brought special attention to the risks faced by children of single parents. Child safety advocates used the case to promote better communication between divorced parents about travel plans and to encourage backup contact systems that could alert authorities more quickly when families fail to arrive at their destinations. The 17-year gap between the disappearance and discovery sparked discussions about how long families should maintain hope. Support groups for families of missing persons now address this directly, helping people understand that hope and acceptance aren't mutually exclusive. The Chen case proved that answers can come even after decades, but it also showed that the truth isn't always what families want to hear. As the investigation files were finally closed in 2014, the case had grown far beyond its original scope. What began as two women who failed to arrive at their destination had become a window into the methods of one of the most methodical killers in modern history. The ripple effects continue to influence law enforcement practices, victim advocacy, and public awareness about personal safety. The ocean that concealed Webb's crimes for so long has given up most of its secrets, but investigators know there are likely other vehicles still resting on the seafloor, holding evidence of crimes that may never be solved. The search continues, driven by the knowledge that somewhere, families are still waiting for their own 17-year mystery to finally end. Sarah and Michelle Chen didn't just disappear on a sunny morning in 1994. They were selected, stalked, and murdered by a predator who thought the vastness of the Pacific Ocean would hide his crimes forever. But water preserves as well as conceals, and eventually, the truth found its way back to the surface. Their story serves as both a warning about the dangers that can hide behind ordinary business relationships and a testament to the power of persistence in seeking justice. The burgundy Honda that emerged from Bandon Harbor carried more than just the remains of two lives cut short. It carried the truth that 17 years of investigation couldn't uncover through traditional methods. Sometimes, justice requires patience, advanced technology, and the willingness to look in places where others have given up hope. Sometimes it takes the ocean itself to reveal what really happened on that coastal highway so many years ago.